This evening, I'd like to talk about two crucial institutions in modern society: democracy and the university. But before I begin, I'd like you to reflect for a moment and ask yourself, what is a democracy? What are the institutions necessary for a democracy? How do we judge whether a country has a functioning democracy? Certainly, these issues have been on our minds as we watch the situation in Egypt unfold over the last number of weeks. And also ask yourself, what's the mission of the university? What are its responsibilities? How do we judge whether a university is adequately fulfilling these responsibilities? Now, I have to tell you, in current pedagogy, what I would do now is give you a pop quiz or ask you to write a 2-minute essay. And you'd have to write down your thoughts on democracy and your thoughts on the university and hand it in. But fortunately for you, I'm rather old school, so I won't ask you to do that. But nonetheless, please hold these reflections with you. And I hope that by the end of the evening, you'll think differently about democracy, differently about the university, and see that they're more closely related than you might otherwise have thought. And I hope, perhaps, you won't just think differently, but in the future might act differently. My analysis deals with the Anglo-American world, but much would apply to Europe and indeed elsewhere. However, I'll begin not by talking about the university or about democracy, but about a book. In 1744, Giambattista Vico published the final edition of his masterwork, Principi di Scienza Nuova, d'intorno alla comune natura delle nazioni, Principles of New Science Concerning the Common Nature of Nations, or as it's generally known, the New Science. This evening's lecture has its origin in the publication of this book. About 12 years ago, a group, I think rather mischievously calling themselves the Toronto Friends of Vico, donated 2 volumes of the collected works of Vico to York University. These are rare books published in Italy in about 1746. Shortly thereafter, through the initiative of Elvio Del Zotto, the Friends of Vico established an annual Giambattista Vico lecture. Universities couldn't accommodate many students until books became generally available after Gutenberg's invention of movable type in the printing press. Previously, of course, books had been handwritten and were very expensive. Gutenberg's inventions made books less expensive. The new science on display here at the back would have been printed using Gutenberg's technology, probably in a small Naples print shop. Only after Gutenberg could students own their own books. Also, more plentiful printed books allowed private reading and private study. When books were few, reading aloud was more common than reading silently. In medieval universities, the lectio, or lecture, meant the professor standing at the front of the room reading from the one copy of the book. Some students would say not that much has changed. Giambattista Vico was born in Naples in 1688 and died there in 1744. In his mid-20s, he became a professor of rhetoric, a position he held for most of his life. As a professor of rhetoric, Vico would have taught, among other things, what we would now consider history, literature, and philosophy, the humanities. The New Science is an ambitious project. The book begins with an engraving and a rather obscure commentary on this engraving. It has the seeing eye of God, and metaphysics standing on the globe, and a statue of Homer, the globe representing the natural world, and then below the statue of Homer, the various symbols representing human institutions. In the next chapter, Vico sets out the separate chronology of 7 civilizations, including the Hebrew, the Phoenician, the Greek, and the Roman. It's all this human history that Vico interprets in the remaining 4 chapters. He sought to demonstrate the common nature of all nations. The University of Naples would have also, of course, taught science, but under the title of natural philosophy. The scientific revolution had brought a new way of seeing the natural world, based on reason and observation, melding theory, experiment, and data, written in the language of mathematics. As Galileo wrote in 1623, the universe stands continually open to our gaze, but it cannot be understood unless one first learns to comprehend the language and interpret the characters in which it is written. It's written in the language of mathematics, and its characters are triangles, circles, and other geometric figures, without which it's humanly impossible to understand a single word of it. Without those, one is wandering around in a dark labyrinth. Isaac Newton, the Englishman, contributed a new mathematics for the study of the universe, of course, as they call it, the calculus. And he contributed much else. His Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, Latin for mathematical principles of natural philosophy, usually called the Principia, published in 1687, is one of the most important scientific books ever written. When I went to look at the Vico volumes in the Scott Library, Suzanne showed us another rare book in the York collection, an early edition of Newton's Principia. It has also been brought here for you to see. If you look closely, you'll see student notes written in the margin of this book from the 1700s. Now, those of you who've been very alert might find it odd that the Englishman, Newton, wrote in Latin. And Vico, the Italian, wrote in Italian. It was just about this time when the universities were switching from Latin to the vernacular in terms of instruction. So Vico's earlier works were in Latin, the new sciences in Italian. Newton's earliest work was in Latin and later was in English. These 2 books represent 2 great traditions of learning. One, from Isaac Newton, studies the natural world. The other, from Giambattista Vico, studies the human world. Vico's genius was to recognize that the methodology needed for the study of the natural world was not adequate for the study of the human world. It couldn't be written in the language of mathematics. As in science, the study of the human world requires reason and observation, but it must be different. Hence his title, The New Science. And in his work, he anticipates many of the intellectual debates of the social sciences and humanities in the 20th century, from Isaiah Berlin, and he's been very influential, including people like Isaiah Berlin, James Joyce, Jean-François Lyotard. He asserts the importance of language, the poetic imagination, and myth. He rejects the Enlightenment idea of progress and sees cyclical patterns. And he foresaw that a purely rationalistic culture could lead to barbarism. Universities today are proud of their continuity, but we should not overstate the similarity of Vico's University of Naples to universities today. Although some leading thinkers of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment held university positions, Vico was professor of rhetoric at the University of Naples, Newton held the Lucasian chair in mathematics at Cambridge. Many, indeed most of the leading thinkers of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment did not hold university positions. The university's mission was not to explore new ideas, or as we say today, to conduct research. Its mission was to teach. The curriculum was designed to provide a liberal education, and the purpose was to develop the mind and character of future leaders. Although writing much later, in the mid-19th century, Cardinal Newman articulated the university's mission in his collected writings, The Idea of a University, which remains the most influential book ever written in the English language about universities. For Newman, the purpose of a university is to provide undergraduate education, and this education should be a liberal education. He began, knowledge is capable of being its own end. Such is the constitution of the human mind that any kind of knowledge, if it be really such, is its own reward. The education must be broad. The student should apprehend the outlines of knowledge, the principles on which it rests, the scale of its parts, its lights and its shades, its great points and its little. If a practical end must be assigned to a university course, I say is that of training good members of society. This was the university's mission. Despite the scientific revolution, universities remained close to the Christian faith. Fellows of Cambridge had to be ordained members of the clergy. Newton was not, and to take the Lucasian chair in mathematics, he had to get special permission from the king. Although universities had faculties of medicine and law, these faculties were not the main route to becoming a doctor or a lawyer. The main route was through apprenticeship to an existing doctor or lawyer, and university study was not required to become an apprentice. Universities were very small, quite minor institutions until well into the 19th century. Only a very small proportion of the population completed grammar school. Of course, they were called grammar schools because you were going on to study and you would read Greek and Latin. So all your preparation was Greek and Latin grammar. So preparation for university was a grammar school. But only a small proportion went to grammar school, let alone to university. And this statement only applies to 1/2 of the population because women weren't admitted to universities. Fundamental change began in the 19th century, but proceeded slowly. As the inventions of the Industrial Revolution multiplied, the contributions of scientific research became more and more evident. Following the lead of the German universities, the Anglo-American universities added research to their mission in the late 19th century. The job of the professor became not just to teach, but to conduct research. This was the greatest transformation in the mission of the university since its beginnings. As an aside, it was the Industrial Revolution, not Gutenberg, which made books truly widely available. It was the invention of the steam-powered printing press and the invention of paper making using wood pulp in the middle of the 19th century, which truly made books an industrial commodity and could be produced efficiently and cheaply. One of the inventors of making paper from wood pulp was a Canadian, Charles Fennerty, from Halifax. And out of his invention came the Canadian newsprint industry. You may not know much about how you make paper. Well, what you do is basically you take a mush of plant fibers, press it very hard to get all the water out till it's nice and firm, roll it, polish it, cut it, and then you have paper. At the time of Vico, paper was made largely with rags. This, of course, was cotton and linen that was now waste. Many of the rags came from, I have to report to you honestly, people's undergarments. So the paper on which it was printed, those volumes back there are printed, are rag paper. It was with Fennerty's invention of making paper from wood pulp that allowed really inexpensive paper and, of course, truly inexpensive books. And so the massive post-war university expansion 100 years later could be possible. Those of you that follow the Giller Prize probably remember Joanna Skibbsrud publication, The Sentimentalists. She was dealing with a press that used Gutenberg's technology and, of course, couldn't distribute a large number of books. It was only when it moved over to a publisher who used an industrial technology that the Sentimentalists could have wide distribution after it won the Giller Prize. With the commitment to research came specialization. The university organized itself into faculties and departments based upon academic disciplines. And with research and specialization came graduate education. In the late 19th century, graduate schools were added to the existing undergraduate colleges. The preparation to practice a profession, whether law or medicine or engineering, inexorably shifted from apprenticeship under a practicing professional to university study, followed by a short apprenticeship. The professional school degree from a university became, in the late 19th century, the decisive qualification of competence. Medical schools, law schools, engineering schools expanded and multiplied. The university had taken on another new responsibility, the educating of professionals. By the early 20th century, the university had completed the long, slow move away from the church. Universities had established themselves as autonomous institutions, self-governing, whose professors had academic freedom in their work. But the university was still not a central institution. This awaited the second half of the 20th century, with the coming of what Daniel Bell has famously called the Post-Industrial Society. The economy, once dominated by the production of goods, becomes dominated by services, including business services like banking, real estate, law, insurance, finance, and other services like education, healthcare, communications, and government services. The professional and the technical class rises to preeminence. Theoretical knowledge becomes central. All throughout society, institutions engaged in self-conscious research programs to advance theoretical knowledge and then apply it to solve problems. We now tend to call this the knowledge-based society. In the post-war knowledge-based society, governments vastly increased their support for universities and asked that they pursue public purposes. First and foremost, governments committed themselves to support expanded undergraduate education. Universities changed from providing elite education to mass education. And second, governments committed themselves to supporting advanced research at universities. Granting councils were formed to support research in science, engineering, health, social science, humanities, and the fine arts. The professional schools expanded further. Today, any would-be profession invariably seeks above all else to have their entrance certified by a university degree. And the quasi-professional schools, business, journalism, public administration, public health, are the same. Now, in many large universities, half of the professors are in the professional and quasi-professional schools rather than the traditional arts and sciences. This late 20th century centrality of the university has only been enhanced over the last 20 years. Under the pressing turbulence of globalization and the growth of India and China, there's a wide consensus that our economic future will depend on our ability to educate and retain highly skilled workers and to innovate. The university has become a crucial institution of the economy. The dominant university type of the 21st century across the Anglo-American world is a university like York, or like U of T, or we could name hundreds. It's probably this type of university that you thought of when I asked you, what are the responsibilities of the university? This type of university has a large undergraduate student body and a large graduate student body. It awards bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees across a wide range of disciplines. It's usually large, 20 to 25,000 students, places heavy emphasis on research, both pure and applied, and it works explicitly to see this research transferred to productive uses in society. Clark Kerr has famously labeled this type of university the multiversity. It has no unifying theme. It has many responsibilities. It's an unwieldy conglomerate, and often these responsibilities are in conflict with one another. This story of the university, from Vico to today, from margin to center, is well known to us. And in the backdrop to this story are the great economic transformations from agricultural to industrial to knowledge-based. But there's another transformation of the modern era, equally important as the economic transformation, and I will argue equally important in moving the university from margin to center, and equally important in creating the multiversity of the late 20th century. This is the political transformation of the modern era, the development of democracy. The modern story of democracy begins at the time of Vico. Following the revolution in scientific thought, Enlightenment thinkers believed reason was the source of all legitimacy and authority, and using reason, critically questioned traditional institutions, customs, and morals, especially the church, religion, and the divine right of kings. Enlightenment thinkers developed a new conception of the legitimacy of government, based in the theory of natural rights. All men are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights. A radical break from the divinely sanctioned hierarchy of feudal society. Men may come together in a social contract to create a government with sovereignty over them, but the government cannot take away these inalienable rights. The citizens may also revolt and overthrow a government whose authority does not arise through the consent of the governed, and revolt they did. The English calls theirs the Glorious Revolution of 1688, when a group of parliamentarians overthrew James II and invited William of Orange to take the throne. This followed closely the passage of the English Bill of Rights in 1689, establishing that the Crown must seek the consent of the people as represented by Parliament. And of course, there was the American Revolution of 1776 and the French Revolution beginning in 1789. But progress was slow toward a truly democratic government. A government, in Lincoln's famous words, of the people, by the people, for the people. What do we require for a democracy? And when were these achieved? Nothing is more antithetical to natural rights than slavery. Yet slavery was only declared unlawful in England in 1772, and even then was allowed in the British Empire until 1833. And of course, it was not abolished in the United States until passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. Democracy requires certain basic civil rights. Everyone has the right to a fair trial and to equal treatment before the law. No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel and inhuman punishment. Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, and the right to freedom of expression and opinion. There should be a free press. These civil rights were secured for all only slowly. Democracy requires basic political rights, universal suffrage, and the right to hold office. There should be regular elections, offering a range of choices, and conducted without intimidation or coercion. But in Canada, women did not receive the right to vote in federal elections until 1917. In 1927, the Supreme Court of Canada was asked whether the word persons in Section 24 of the British North America Act included female persons. The Supreme Court of Canada answered no. Only through an appeal to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council of England in the famous Persons case was the decision reversed, allowing women to be appointed to the Canadian Senate. And of course, civil rights are for all, and therefore minority rights must be protected in a democracy. A majority, even if elected through universal suffrage in a fair election, cannot be allowed to take away the rights of minorities. Protecting minority rights has been a still unfinished task. Also, a democratic government must reach its decisions transparently and without corruption. It must be accountable, not just in the sense of the ballot box, but it must be accountable in the sense of giving a proper account. How was the decision reached, and what are the likely implications of these decisions? By the early 1930s, all Canadians had the basic civil rights and political rights. We had regular, free, and fair elections and diverse political parties from which to choose. We had a free press. Democracy was well established. We had a government of the people and by the people. And when I asked you at the beginning, what is a democracy? What do we look for in a country to see whether it's democratic? You probably thought first about suffrage and holding office, about the right to a fair trial, freedom of expression, and so on. These are what we have in Canada, and these, as we've certainly seen over the last period, brought so closely to our attention, have been what are missing in Egypt. But what does the story of democracy, this great transformation from the Enlightenment to today, have to do with the university? Democracy and the university share many fundamentals. The defining proclamations of democratic ideals come from the Enlightenment, preceded by its antecedents of Renaissance humanism and the scientific revolution. These same great intellectual movements are the roots of the modern university. Freedom of thought and expression and academic freedom are obviously closely related. But democracy in the university did not develop in parallel fashion, or even in a mutually supporting fashion. Even in the 1930s, universities were small bastions of the establishment. And like the establishment, the university students and professors did not include many women, or Jews, or other minorities. Universities could not be considered crucial to the development of democracy. And indeed, in the admission of their students and the hiring of their professors, actively resisted the development of democracy. Democracy in the university truly came together in the second half of the 20th century, when a new type of democracy developed. After the Second War, nations returned to the idea of natural rights, and in 1948, the new United Nations adopted and proclaimed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It begins in Article 1 with the basic Enlightenment position. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights then goes on to set out the civil rights we've talked about, the political rights we've talked about, but then it goes on to articulate economic, social, and cultural rights, which are indispensable for dignity and the free development of the personality. The right to education receives its own article. Article 26 of the Universal Declaration reads, "Education shall be free, at least at the elementary and fundamental stages. Elementary education shall be compulsory. Technical and professional education shall be generally available, and higher education shall be equally accessible to all on the basis of merit." It's through education that we can be equal and free. Through education, we can develop our endowments of reason and conscience. Through education, that all can have dignity and the free development of the personality. The post-war democracies are a new kind of democracy, a mix of democracy and capitalism committed to work for the full realization of these economic, social, and cultural rights. They are to be a government not just of the people and by the people, but for the people. They're committed to work for the welfare of all, and hence have been called welfare states. These democratic governments accepted the responsibility to work toward employment for all. They would provide social insurance against the risks of modern life, unemployment and disability insurance, health insurance, old age pensions, and they would provide education. The post-war university, like York, like U of T, was called for as much by this political transformation, the democratic welfare state, as by the economic transformation, the knowledge-based economy. It was democracy's commitment to equality of opportunity and social inclusion that led us to move from elite to mass higher education. It was democracy's commitment to work for the general welfare of all that led to the support for university research. But the university's connection to democracy goes much deeper than this. The modern democratic state is large and powerful. A modern democracy requires not just regular, free, and fair elections to hold the government accountable. It also requires that authority and power be dispersed, that there should be institutions of legitimacy and influence that are independent, particularly of the state, but also from the large corporate institutions of the modern economy. The most obvious countervailing institution that we always recognize in a democracy is the free press. But there are many others: religious groups, ethnic associations, labor unions, voluntary associations, all help to create this dispersal of legitimacy and authority. We sometimes call these groups civil society. The university is very important in this dispersal of power. It's a source of new ideas, alternative visions, and social criticism. This most emphatically does not mean that the university becomes a source of opposition to the government. As an institution, it must remain neutral. Rather, it means that the university is a place for information, analysis, expression of opinion, and deliberation. Many students of democracy argue that today, the legitimacy of democratic government does not rest on civil and political rights, on universal suffrage and elections, on voting and representativeness, because these have now been largely assured. Rather, legitimacy rests on the nature and quality of deliberation. All citizens should have the ability and the opportunity to participate in the deliberations about decisions which affect them. In a deliberative democracy, deliberation occurs not just in the explicit political process, but in the many dispersed forums and institutions of civil society. The university is a vital institution in a deliberative democracy. And finally, we get to the most crucial nexus between education and democracy. First, of course, education must be accessible for there to be a full democracy. But second, the educational system is crucial in preparing citizens. Where do democratic citizens come from? Of course, the family has a role, the larger community has a role, but education is crucial in creating democratic citizens. Here, Amy Gutman's reflections in her book, Democratic Education, are especially clear-headed and insightful. Education should develop what sometimes called deliberative, what she calls interchangeably democratic character. Such character involves moral reasoning and the development of capacities for criticism and rational argument, by being taught how to think logically, to argue coherently and fairly, to consider relevant alternatives before coming to a conclusion. Basic democratic virtues such as truthfulness, toleration, and a predisposition to nonviolence should be inculcated. People must learn to behave in accordance with authority and to think critically about authority if they are to live up to the democratic ideal of sharing power and sovereignty as citizens. The development of democratic character begins in primary school, continues through secondary school, and on to the university. Universities are well suited to learning about how to think critically and analytically about political problems and how to articulate one's views and defend them before people who disagree. But the fundamental purpose of universities is to be institutional sanctuaries against the tyranny of ideas. Control of the creation of ideas and insulating them from critical scrutiny subverts democracy. Universities provide a realm where new and orthodox ideas are judged on their intellectual merits, and where men and women who defend such ideas are not strangers, but members of the community. Universities and democracies are intimately connected. Universities are fundamental institutions of democratic life today. One of their responsibilities is to contribute to democratic life. I hope by now you're persuaded. Now let's turn to the state of democracy in Canada. Certainly we have all the civil rights and the political rights. And despite the power of neoliberalism, the welfare state has not really been rolled back. Some programs have been curtailed, others have been reformed, but we've not retreated from our commitments to employment, to security against ill health and disability, to security in old age. We differ about means, not ends. Education and research are well supported. We have a free press. By these indicators, we have a strong democracy. And in international comparisons, we fall into the top of the league tables labeled full democracies. But despite this report card, there is a malaise. The problem is hard to articulate precisely. People express their concerns in different ways, identify different concerns, and offer different diagnoses. But an often heard phrase is that we have a democratic deficit. People are disillusioned about electoral politics, evident in declining voter turnout and declining participation in all aspects of party politics. During elections, politicians make promises, and after they're elected, they ignore them. Power has been centralized in the leader, and the role of the elected member has declined. At best, a bemused interest, and at worst, a hardened cynicism is a common stance, especially among the young. We've emphasized too much the rights of the citizen and not enough the responsibilities of the citizen. The civility and public spiritedness that should mark the lives of citizens seems to be disappearing. The quality of public discussion declines. Often it's fractious and polarized. A new elite has emerged, which is influential and powerful, but which is increasingly aloof from the concerns of regular citizens. Some argue we're drifting toward a plutocracy. Power lies not with the people, but with wealth. In a plutocracy, we have government by the wealthy, for the wealthy. There are many enemies of democracy. In Vico's time, they were kings and princes, aristocrats with great land holdings, popes and abbots. And other times it's been generals in their armed forces or leaders of huge industrial corporations. In the immediate post-war period, General Eisenhower warned Americans of the military-industrial complex. And from time to time, the high civil service allies itself with democracy's opponents. And there are other opponents. In a democracy, ordinary people are asked to make decisions rather than experts. And ordinary people are asked to make judgments on their leaders. The heart of democracy is the idea that ordinary people have the wisdom to govern themselves. The challenging question is, do ordinary people have such wisdom? Many people have been skeptical, arguing that experts are better qualified. Democracy is not easy to implement and not easy to maintain. It's really an ideal toward which we must constantly strive. We'll never have a fully realized democracy. The job of sustaining democracy is, of course, the responsibility of citizens, parliamentarians, parliaments. But addressing the democratic deficit is also the responsibility of other institutions, including our universities. How well are our universities doing this part of their job? The preeminent responsibility in a democracy of universities is to be accessible to all who are capable and committed. Here we do very well. In Canada today, among youth aged 24 to 26, 40% have attended university, and 79% have participated in some form of post-secondary education. Yes, some groups, Aboriginal people, people from low-income families, and certain ethnic groups and recent immigrants are underrepresented in universities. But overall, the commitment to accessibility is strong and the record excellent. We've overcome the historical underrepresentation of women. Our second democratic responsibility is to be a place for information, analysis, expression of opinion, and deliberation. A realm where new and unorthodox ideas are judged on their intellectual merits. Despite some lapses, and despite the frequent criticism in the press of the supposed power of political correctness on campus, I think the university has used its autonomy and academic freedom well. I can think of no institution that houses such a diversity of opinion, so openly expressed, and most importantly, that so fiercely erupts when an unpopular opinion seems to be suppressed. Although most of our research is curiosity-driven, a democratic society supports this research because of its expectation that in the long run it will be of benefit to society. Again, I think universities are fulfilling this responsibility well. University-based research is recognized as contributing to our health, our economy, to public policy, and to cultural flourishing. In these respects, the university is fulfilling its democratic responsibilities. But in others, it is not. I believe the university's greatest failing is in how we think about the purposes of a university education, how we think about the responsibilities of the university. We have not recognized sufficiently that the university has a responsibility, among its many responsibilities, to contribute to democracy. Since the very first universities, the purpose of an undergraduate education was to provide a liberal education. And one of the purposes of a liberal education was to prepare for citizenship. Newman called it preparing good members of society. However, when our students arrive on campus today, we don't offer them a liberal education. We offer degrees which are specialized. Ask a student what they're studying at university, they'll reply biology, psychology, economics, and so on. The purpose of those degrees is to acquire a depth of knowledge in one field, and also in this process to acquire skills that are transferable to future employment. Sometimes there's a bit of a requirement for breadth, but nowhere do we thoughtfully design our programs to prepare students for their future role as citizens. We prepare them for economic life, but not for democratic life. We develop their endowment of reason, but not their endowment of conscience. We have all but abandoned this fundamental purpose of undergraduate education. Here we do not serve our democracy well. In a closely related development, although caused by many forces not discussed here, the humanities, history, literature, philosophy, Vico's fields, are being slowly marginalized within the university. They're seen as peripheral to the economic challenges of globalization and to the innovation agenda. Reading in the humanities has always been associated with citizenship and the moral imagination, or as Martha Nussbaum has called it, the narrative imagination. The ability to think what it might be like to be in the shoes of a different person, to be an intelligent reader of that person's story. The narrative imagination helps us to realize all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience. Her most recent book is subtitled, Why Democracy Needs the Humanities. If the university cannot assure the centrality of the humanities, it cannot fulfill its obligations to democratic life. Further, and rather paradoxically, the university creates deep problems for democracy through its very successes on behalf of democracy. The university is publicly supported and has taken on many public tasks and does these very well. But in so doing, it's moved closer to government and to business. It has retreated from its role as an autonomous institution of civil society, ensuring the dispersal of authority and legitimacy. The centrality of the university and its very success reinforces the view that expertise is needed to interpret the world. The value of citizen wisdom in democratic dialogue is diminished. Why participate in decision-making when it's going to be made by experts, who more often than not have advanced degrees from the university? And also the emphasis on expertise turns political questions into technical questions. In principle, politics is concerned with determining the nature of an ideal society. Democratic politics seeks the conditions for the best possible lives of all citizens. Technical analysis pushes this into the background. While the accessible university breaks down the differences amongst us based on family background and social class, it creates new differences based upon academic achievement. The new difference is meritocratic, the old aristocratic. But both are troubling to democracy. In the knowledge-based economy and in the turbulence of globalization over the past 20 years, many have prospered, but many more have seen their prospects diminish. Those who have prospered are increasingly different and distant from the ordinary citizen. A new class has emerged that I shall call the new patricians. Who are the new patricians? Several years ago, Samuel Huntington characterized the Davos culture. Let me quote him directly. Each year, businessmen and women, bankers, government officials, intellectuals, and journalists from around the world meet in the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. Almost all of these people hold university degrees in the physical sciences, social sciences, business, or law. They work with words or numbers, are reasonably fluent in English, are employed by governments, corporations, and academic institutions. They have extensive international involvements and travel frequently outside their own country. His attributes on that list are attributes of what I call the new patricians. Its membership are the leadership of government, both politicians and senior civil servants, the business, the media, the professions, and academia. Ironically, the new patricians who meet in Davos are very interested in public policy, but unfortunately not much interested in democracy. The new patrician class is highly accomplished. Its members have achieved their leadership through open, competitive, and meritocratic processes. Unfortunately, this very meritocratic process allows some of them to feel absolved from the responsibilities to the general welfare that leadership entails. The financial crisis of the past few years offers an example. Leaders of our financial institutions earned handsome compensation as central actors in a process which ultimately devastated the savings of many, hiked unemployment, and left governments with huge debts for their citizens to pay off. Yet they've accepted no responsibility and soon returned to their handsome compensation. Of course, some of the blame for the financial crisis must fall on lawyers, regulators, politicians, and academics, including many economists, I'm sorry to say. They too seem oblivious to any responsibility. The increased share of income and wealth going to the top 1% of the population is deeply troubling for democracy, and our failure to address it revealing of the nature of political power today. But I believe that the leaders of our financial institutions are only the most visible symbol of a deeper issue. The declining commitment of some members of the new patrician class to the welfare of all in democratic society. Not all patricians ignore their broader responsibility, and of course the Roman patricians were the noble families that had special places in the Senate and were deeply committed to the well-being of Rome. But many of the new patricians used their power and privilege to sustain the patrician class. In the past, tradition and family have nurtured the recognition that with power comes responsibility. But the influence of family and tradition are much diminished. How is this recognition nurtured? That with power comes responsibility. How is it nurtured in the new patricians? The university helps create the new patricians in a knowledge-based society. It's both the gatekeeper and the educator. It's the gatekeeper to advanced education, and it educates those who take advanced degrees and the professions. The university offers a demanding and competitive academic program. Those who graduate top of their class in law school, top of their class in economics or biology, top of their class in business school, have every right to believe that they've achieved this on the basis of merit. But as universities think about the purposes of advanced education, they've focused on graduating highly skilled practitioners. Certainly there's some discussion about educating ethical practitioners, but universities have not grappled with the dilemma that some of their graduates will become powerful individuals in a democracy. Powerful individuals in a democracy. An oxymoron, to be sure, but it's the oxymoron of the knowledge-based society. The university has not confronted the reality that it's a fundamental institution creating the new patrician class, and has not grappled with the question of how to educate the future patricians, whose future power and privileges, however justly earned, must carry responsibilities to democratic life. Let me close with the famous quotation, "What is to be done?" The most important step is to think differently. I hope when you think about democracy, you'll think, of course, about civil rights and political rights, but you'll also think about the other institutions of civil society necessary for a democracy. And when talk turns to the democratic deficit, I hope you'll think about the university as an institution that should help to address it. And I hope you'll think about universities differently. Today's universities have many responsibilities. Yes, they're places of teaching and research. Yes, they're fundamental institutions of the 21st century economy, but they're also fundamental institutions of 21st century democracy. And so our universities should be judged not just by the quality and contributions of their research, not just by the learning and accomplishments of their graduates, but also by their preparation of citizens for democracy. The character of our age threatens to transform the university. The multiversity is drifting, uncertain of its responsibilities and the balance among them. The multiversity is suffering from mission drift, and our inheritance is at risk. Our democracy is at risk. Let us not allow this to happen. Thank you.